Thanks so much for the introduction and the invitation. I'd like to take you along the route of behavioral science and introduce you a bit into how it can help you to derive playlisting insights. Because I undertook a research project where I looked at a problem which is not only of interest to the music industry because of economic reasons, but also because it uncovers so far untapped theories of music psychology and sociology and intertwines them with economic benefits. In more detail, it deals with the missing understanding of consumption preferences of music streaming listeners. And I assume, as most of you know, in 2017, music streaming overtook physical sales for the first time. And this also was accompanied by a change in how music is being consumed. And there are currently no frameworks in musicology nor in the music industry that would allow us to dive deeper in those listening preferences. On the side of the industry with music analytical tools, those are mainly dominated by one-dimensional analysis, which only look back at sales data or at streams. And on the side of musicology, with the music psychology and sociology, you mostly get older theoretical frameworks which don't relate to the newer adoptions of streaming behavior. And in my job as a label analyst, I was daily confronted with rising numbers of requests on listener-centric indicators. And that was during my time with Warner Music's Spin-In Records. And that problem just led me into difficulties because I couldn't answer the questions in a satisfying way because those indicators were just not quite readily available in market analytic tools. And this problem slowly transformed into my research question, which I picked up in my doctoral research. And thus originating in the deficiencies and shortcomings of existing music analytical tools, I faced the challenge to enhance and combine existing approaches. And ultimately, I have to be honest, I didn't come up with one world revolutionizing tool. However, I did provide some techniques and frameworks which can be consulted to optimize A&R strategies, brand partnerships, and marketing campaigns, and are currently being used by Sony as well as Warner Music. Among the previously existing tools, there were, for example, Asahi, Soundcharts, or Nielsen, which you might be familiar with. I call those one-dimensional because even if they do integrate multiple verticals such as sales, airplays, streaming, and social media data, their approach is entirely sales rather than consumer-oriented. And those are ultimately only relevant for a limited amount of analytical calculations, like in business development or sales. They always prefer quantitative over qualitative metrics, sales-oriented over consumption-oriented metrics, and don't really pay attention to interrelation with behavioral and contextual insights. And that is what I wanted to move towards. Though incorporating the listener context and the listener's motivation, I found to be really interesting to enable an understanding of the audience and how they consume the music. Thus, the set goal was clear. I meant to combine a sales-centric view with a user-centric view, and combining the best of the currently established psychological and sociological frameworks with the capabilities which industry analytics tools provided so far. And this would enable us to determine not only what and how much music is being consumed, but also by whom, when, and how. And this could eventually enable us to automatically create personalized user experiences tailored to one's listening type in the future. And thus, I first of all went on the search for the best suitable music format that would deliver the required data. Needed was a music format that would allow us to extract as much metrics in relation to context, a listener's interaction and behavior as possible. Since single track releases are nowadays oftentimes consumed without any further overarching musical context, oftentimes even like detached from an album, singular tracks wouldn't serve our needs. And then I took a look at playlists. And that was especially relevant because since the rise of music streaming over the last few years, playlists have been positioned in the center of music consumption. Last year, for instance, 57% of all Spotify streams have been generated via playlists. And the bare numbers in the image I'm sharing just shows the relevance based on that 40 million tracks, which are being offered in the Spotify catalog by its curators and brands, have meanwhile been transformed into 2 billion playlists. And thus, this format is at this point crucial not only for breaking a song, but also for understanding the playlist audience. Why do they consume it and in which ways? And from there on, I wanted to know a bit more about how can we cater specific listener types. For instance, someone who wants to go to a leisurely Sunday stroll, someone who wants to listen to music to intensify the focus while studying, someone who just wants to have fun and hang out with their friends. Some other listener who might want to discover brand new music and be exposed to new content. Or the last one, someone who knows specifically what they are looking for, in that case, classical dance music. To achieve a better understanding of what content we could serve to those people and ultimately achieve personalized targeting of music, a lot of data is needed in order to create that backbone. And thus, I started working at the intersection of consumer research and business analytics. I enhanced current methods by developing a multidimensional approach based on concatenating data analytics. Now I want to break down those complex words for you a little bit. Multidimensional approach is basically just referring to me taking principles from a variety of sources in this context. Because of the underlying sources, they are from streaming platforms as well as content owners, market research, and behavioral science coming together from different disciplines. And concatenating data analytics describes the union of quantitative as well as qualitative data outputs. On the quantitative side, we have data from a token database originating in Spotify's API, market benchmarks, as well as audio features. In between data, those are relational metrics which need translation in order to be able to be compared on a common denominator. And those are, for instance, skips, saves, and also track metadata. And thirdly, categorical features, which are, for instance, consumption activities that are being performed alongside, day type of the consumption, or required pre-knowledge to find certain playlists or titles. And so far, like it was until, let's say, 2 years ago, before auditorial playlists have been introduced, whenever you got a recommendation, you were basically put into a pool of people who previously, based on their listening history, have been listening to something similar than you. Thus, you've just basically been thrown into a pool but not received truly personalized content. Those approaches are entirely limited to music-related parameters, neglecting the interaction and perception as well as demographic profiles. And thus I meant to make those metrics more tangible by categorizing them into contexts and mood-related segments. And early on, based on the first data excerpts, I wasn't able to detect 5 different listening patterns for the ritualizer, the regulator, socializer, seeker, and definer. And based on those 5 categories and additional statistical analysis, I got to be able to define those segments more clearly. And the main criteria for distinction were determined by their psychological motivation to listen to music and the specific moment in which they listen, as well as the behavior they displayed while consuming music. And thus, overall, this model facilitates the perception of listenership and also contours who listens, why, when, and to what. But that, of course, needed a bit further analysis on the data side. And now I'm just sharing with you a bit more about the methodological approach of how we derived all of those data points. So as I mentioned, motivation and context were the originating factors, and we just tried to script out those 5 segments into which we could compartmentalize the users. Thereafter, we took 10,000 playlists, and based on those, we undertook an analysis of 4 different factors. Those being the acoustic features, the interaction features, product features, and relational ones. So acoustic would include all the acoustic attributes of the audio metrics of a track. Interaction are, for instance, skips and saves. Product features range from metadata to release format, and relational are again about context, daytime, pre-required knowledge to find it. From that point on, we derived a parameter distinction index, which would allow us to say, yes, for the ritualizer, it's really important to look at those relational features. It sets itself really apart by those features, or neglect the other ones. And ultimately that led us to an audience segment confidence index, which I'll explain in the results section a bit more, and that is telling you which of the dedicated audience segments we can predict to the best extent. And from there, I needed to first of all create that analytical backbone. And that was based on a Python database that tapped into the API of Spotify. And that database allowed me to understand the listeners from a more user-centric perspective. An exemplary excerpt of behavioral data is shown on the next image, and where I just wanted to give you an understanding of which metrics we looked at and how, in a simplified way, you could try to break down the different user types. This analysis was based on the 20,000 playlists, and we looked into how do people interact with them. The 3 circles refer to the degree of importance for a metric for a selected audience segment. And when looking at the behavioral attributes of each listener segment, we can accentuate the highlights that, for instance, seekers and definers display an averagely high interaction potential within the first metric categories, whereas the completion and the activity get the lowest degree assigned. Since seekers and definers approach the listening session with the main incentive of actively engaging and listening to the music, this is their main activity, and they don't perform as many activities alongside. So the focus is clearly set on the music. This results in higher discovery rates, save rates, as well as skip rates, because they tend to engage with the content a bit more. Alongside, it requires higher pre-knowledge about the musical content in order to understand and enjoy and find it. And when comparing the seeker to the definer, we also see a clear difference among the metrics for discovery and skips. This is due to the difference in incentives when starting the listening session, because the seeker seeks to be exposed or expose himself to new content and thus to discover within a certain scope, whereas the definer defines more precisely what content he wants to listen to and goes into the listening process by already partially limiting the discovery scope. Additionally, the overall amount of new and unknown or very different content is more limited for him. In the way how I position the displayed behavioral metrics in the lower two ones, you see certain symmetries, which let us further categorize the audience segments. The symmetry is in one case very apparent among the knowledge and the activity metrics, if you look onto the right side, while the segments at the lower end of the spectrum display a high degree of musical pre-knowledge, the upper ones don't. And this sort of lets you assess in what context you could target a specific listener if he would be available to actively listen to the music, and how it lets, for instance, a marketing manager assess in what context they could reach out to it, and if it would be a primary activity or if the music would just subconsciously in the background influence or accompany a situation. And yes, insights like that led us to our final audience assessment. And within it, you see that we split up yet again the 5 audience segments as per their activity scope. And we defined them based on their motivation and context, and quantified and assessed them based on the measures for differentiation for specific metrics. I just want to take you through to give you a bit of better understanding of what contexts you'd find them in and how we defined them. So the ritualizer, he is motivated by a context where he wants to create comfort and structure in a daily routine. And the music can support this by creating a sense of familiarity. You are not likely to see a lot of saves and skips, but a reasonably high degree of discovery. And artist genres only fluctuate between playlists, but not within playlists. For the regulator, you see that they use music mainly to enhance states, such as activities or emotions. And that also gets reflected, for instance, in the amount of emotional references that you'll find in playlist titles and track titles. Socializer, they prefer mainstream vibes, consume music in social settings, and you would find a very high degree of mixed popularity scores in those playlists, as well as a very high different mix of artist genres. In terms of the seeker, we've already scratched the surface of that one a bit more. He really has a curiosity to get exposed to new content and saturate that drive by listening to new hits. We saw a really wide dispersion of follow accounts for the artist, as well as popularity, because those are prone to listen to artists which are either upcoming or already very popular. This is why you have such a wide gap. Emotional reference aren't found too often. There's no specific indication. Pre-knowledge is needed for looking it up. and the discovery rate is really high, as most of the content they expose themselves is new to them and hasn't been recorded in their previous listening history. The definer uses the act of listening to music as something that helps him form his identity, searches for content specifically, and is thus the most knowledgeable listener of them all. Something that I want to point out in addition is now I've explained a bit about how we can differentiate those 5 segments. However, an average consumer finds themselves mostly in 2.5 of those segments, and that already details that they are transformative states. You can shift throughout the day, but most consumers would say that they mostly find themselves in 2 of them. But depending on the daily situations and the activities you perform, you might see yourself shift from one into another. And this much about the core metrics. I wanted to show you a bit more of how you can derive further quintessential insights from additional resources beyond motivation and context and differentiating measures. Those could come from acoustics and demographics as well. And for this example, I looked into different running playlists, which are all in the regulator segment to enhance a currently ongoing activity. Looking at the acoustic features, I thought it was really interesting to see that they're almost the same for different kinds of audiences which the depicted playlists are targeted at. However, when you specifically look into the last 2 ones, you will figure that Workout for Girls and the workout playlist from Trap Nation have a few more details. In that case, Workout for Girls is the only one that also incorporates a high degree of acoustic features, and Trap Nation one which includes also a high degree of instrumental features, detailing that those audiences might be more open to also have some tracks with more acoustic or instrumental tendencies included in those playlists. And by analyzing that, they could tell a marketing or a streaming manager what they could include while curating those playlists. Okay, going from there, I just wanted to highlight that those analytics enable us a bit more to understand a listener beyond the mere numbers. However, there are already a few other industries that have been taking advantage of such methodologies. One, for instance, is Tesla Motors. And what they did is quite intriguing, because how we look at it is that the listener needs to define the listening context before we can assess or target them in a specific way. So there always has to be someone telling us, either let's say, if it's a marketing campaign, the marketing manager needs to tell us, okay, the campaign will be set in this scene, or this activity will be performed. Or a user needs to go onto a streaming platform and tell us what listening context he is in at the moment. But what Tesla Motors does by making use of multi-device tracking and interconnected environments, they assess the current situation of a person and thus automatically create personalized content for the driver in the car. Other branches, for instance, also in marketing, also took advantage of such analytical features. For instance, Sony Electronics paired with Spinning Records for a brand partnership a year ago in order to promote the release of a new phone to a specific audience. And in that case, they knew exactly who the target group should be. So they added not only the motivation and the context and the acoustic features, but also demographics into the mix, which allowed us to further refine what music we could add as a sync to this brand partnership, as they detailed that they wanted young metropolitan male audience, and the branding context was at a music festival, and they wanted electronic music. So it allows you to further skim down what music could please the audience the most in a creational context, as well as in a consumer context. And I think overall, with those words, I'd like to round off. We need to pose the question how important context in music listening is, since the context accommodates the incentives for listening to music. And I think it could be argued that the context sort of bears the incentives, and with it also the passion. And passion is key to reach people in meaningful ways through music. And thus, I think it would be important to learn more about streaming behavior and continue the path down in behavioral science combined with music analytics. And if you have any further questions on that, please let me know.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie, so much for your presentation. We all think it's a pleasure to really dive deep into this topic, and so says our chat as well. We have a lot of great comments who just want to highlight how good your presentation was. So many thanks for that.
Thanks so much.
Since most of or all of the questions are in English, we just continue the Q&A in English, I guess, since it's a little bit easier. One question that was asked a couple of times was, how can you get data like, for example, skips? Is there any way, without being a professional data scientist or programmer, to get these data from Spotify?
Okay, so skips and saves, as well as the origin of the stream source, are always bound to token data. And in order to derive token data, you need to be the owner of the music content. Thus, for me, it was rather easy. Being employed by Warner Music, we had access to the save and skip rates of our own tracks, which you would derive from the Spotify API, but unfortunately, you do need to be the owner of the content. In any other way, you can't access those granular details. However, what I'd like to point out is try to Google the metrics analytics site on Spotify, which allows you to already get a lot of content about a track and, for instance, its acoustic features without being the owner of the content. So if you just try to discover the Spotify API, besides the interaction data, you'd already be able to pull out a bit without owning the content.
Thanks so much for the insights. I think that answers some of the questions we had in our chat. Another one was how you can use these data, these different user types for marketing and for targeting. Could you point it out a little bit more?
Yes, exactly. So for instance, with like the last example I brought up, which was the brand partnership between Sony Electronics and Spinning Records, they told us that they want to collaborate with like any of our artists. They need a track, and this is the imagery which they have in mind for the branding video, for the marketing campaign. So immediately we had a few more metrics to hold on to, because usually a marketing director from a brand will tell you that this is like the age bracket we want to target, and maybe this is the gender and this is the area. But adding the context so far didn't help us much, because the music industry didn't know how to specifically react to it. But now that we know that they were, in this case, aiming at a socializer context, we knew that we can limit the amount, limit the selection of the tracks by a lot more, because we knew in more detail what that audience would prefer in terms of acoustic features, popularity, as well as in genres. We could already limit them more in order to appeal to the audience in the best way possible.
All right, thank you very much. Concerning the artists, there were some questions in our live chat as well. How could artists use these data for themselves, or can they, for example, know which user types their audience consists of?
Yes, so I think in the creational process, it is really interesting to think of who you want to target your music to, and then just play with the metrics and not try to strike too far out. However, I do need to say that within a creational map, you still need to keep in mind that those aren't very rigid constructs. There are some tracks that could be placed in two categories, let's say, for instance, the regulator and the ritualizer context. So you could, of course, also try to appeal to two sets of users, but just keeping in mind what context you see that track to arise in would also increase the chances of being added to specific playlists, because you just consider also what other tracks would surround yours within a playlist, because nowadays you don't control necessarily which tracks your personal one gets delivered with. But just keeping the context in mind would help us to form that picture in some way before it hits the Spotify algorithm.
Sophie, many thanks again for sharing insights and just sharing insights of your work and your studies. It was extremely helpful for us, and there's applause for you in the chat, and we just say thank you. Greetings to London. Thank you for being with us at Future Music Camp.
Okay, thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of the day.